Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your update for May 11th, 2021. I'm going to be looking at two stories today, one of which we've covered before, but it continues to emerge as a leading concern for millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, which is the increase in inflation, which is a deliberate policy of the central bankers. You have the comments from Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who said it's encouraging to see a moderate increase in inflation. In fact, the Fed claims that it's attempting to achieve at least a 2% annual increase of inflation, maybe even a little bit higher, because for some reason they think that is something that will achieve stability in the economy. Now, of course, the motor of inflation is the continuation of the zero interest or near zero interest rate policies of the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world, who are flooding markets with liquidity. The liquidity is going largely to banks and investment companies that make loans available to corporations that are insolvent, that cannot stay above water. And the side effect of this, of course, is that these are corporations already overloaded with debt who are taking on more debt by borrowing the money, which they're using in many cases to buy their own stock or to invest in other kinds of speculative activity. Now, these are what are called technically zombie corporations. It's a corporation that doesn't make enough profit to cover the interest on its debt. So how is it that giving them extra money to engage in speculation is somehow going to stabilize them and stabilize the economy? Now, they do this because they expect to be bailed out. But whatever happened to the lectures from the pious bankers about moral hazard, that you should not take on debt which you cannot liquidate? Now, I covered this last week, but I just want to remind you that Federal Reserve Board of Governor member Lael Brainerd gave a warning last week where she said, quote, "Vulnerabilities associated with elevated risk appetite are rising." In other words, why higher risk? Because they need to make more income. And the higher the risk, the more income you can make, but also the bigger loss you can take. Now, she goes on to say that the seeking of a higher return, the high risk, stretches valuations. In other words, what is a stretched valuation? It's a bubble. And she goes on to say that this amplifies the effects of a repricing event. In other words, a crash. Now, this is supposed to be a good thing. Let's listen to a little bit more of this. The Bloomberg Commodity Price Index is up 62% from April 2020 to April 2021. Now, this index is an average. It's not what everyone pays on these are spot market prices, so it's not what everyone pays. However, it does show a definite trend upward, 62%. Now, we have the comment from BlackRock, which is the company that is leading the charge for a financial regime change as part of the Great Reset, one of their spokesmen said this is a positive step. Someone named Evie Hambro, who's BlackRock's head of thematic investing. Here's what she said about the inflation rate. "There's still quite a lot of room to go. We're testing the upper ranges of commodity markets to work out what the new price range is going to be." Who are they testing it on? They're testing it on you, basically to see what you're willing to accept. Now, here are some of the figures. The median home price is up 18% over last year. Lumber prices are up almost 200% since 2020. Plywood prices are up over 200%. This adds between $20,000 and $24,000 to the price of a typical new single-family home. As far as global food price index, it's up 30.7% in 1 year. And U.S. food costs are going up, in some cases considerably. Well, maybe you'll have to start eating fake meat, or fake food like cardboard. Except the problem is cardboard prices are also going up. So we've got to keep our eye on this. The solution is simple. We need to reject the Great Reset and go back to the policies of LaRouche's 4 laws of regulated banking, so you don't have this speculative system that's protected by bailouts, investment in real physical production, not commodity speculation, and investment in infrastructure, which is absolutely essential for the smooth running and the stability of an economy, and research and development with investment in the frontiers of technology and science, which will ultimately lead to the discoveries that will cheapen costs. Simple, but apparently not on the radar of the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, and certainly not on the minds of people in Congress who are debating whether or not we need tax cuts and more austerity. Now, the other story has to do with Mexico, where, as many of you know, there's been a heating up of the situation on our southern border with Mexico regarding immigration, where the Biden administration has shown that they're clueless in how to handle this, at least so far. Well, here's a story that hasn't gotten much coverage. The Mexican government of Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador filed an official diplomatic protest with the Biden administration over its funding of what the Mexicans are calling interference in Mexican internal affairs. Interference? Well, didn't we call that meddling when we accused the Russians of doing it? Falsely accused the Russians of doing it. But AMLO, as the Mexican president is known, has pay stubs to prove it, to prove that the United States is funding regime change operations in Mexico. They have evidence that the State Department Agency for International Development is financing a non-governmental organization called Mexicans Against Corruption. This should be called Mexicans for Regime Change. As many of you may know, Glenn Greenwald recently published a book exposing the Operation Car Wash in Brazil, a so-called anti-corruption operation that sent former Mexican President Lula to prison falsely based on trumped-up charges designed to bring down his government. Well, we're seeing something similar now unfolding in Mexico. There are also U.S. funds going to something called Article 19, which is a so-called press freedom human rights group. Article 19 is a reference to the International Convention on Human Rights. Article 19 is a British non-governmental organization, and they're accusing Lopez Obrador of suppressing freedom of the press, and they get funding from the UK, the US, and the European Union. Now, what is the Agency for International Development? Why are they funding regime change in Mexico? Well, this is what they do. Their current director is Samantha Power, a promoter of the idea of regime change from her days at the United Nations as the U.S. ambassador under Obama to the UN, where she formulated this idea called responsibility to protect, which means it's up to the unilateral controllers of the United States to determine which governments should be overthrown and which ones should be allowed to stay in power. So the fact that she's now at AID, and AID is continuing the funding of an institution committed to regime change in Mexico, ought to raise some very serious questions about why she's allowed to continue doing this when her policies were involved in a number of other, or defense rather, at the UN of a number of other regime changes, including Libya and Ukraine. Now, Lopez Obrador came out with a very strong statement that this is a violation of the Mexican Constitution to accept money from any other country for political purposes. He charged, quote, "That is treason against the fatherland." Well, he's right. It should not be allowed. And he has the evidence to prove that it's going on, to prove that the Biden administration, through AID, is funding an operation to overthrow his government. This is serious, and this is something that has to have a consequence. I don't know, is someone going to issue sanctions against Joe Biden or Samantha Power? Well, we'll see. What we need, though, is a new paradigm which says there is no legitimate right for any government to interfere in the internal affairs of another government. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with you tomorrow.